Good afternoon or good morning. My name is Earl Taylor. I'm the Chief Knowledge Officer at the Marketing Science Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today to our lunch lecture online program on designing for all, creating customer value via inclusive design. As many of you know, MSI helps marketers become better marketers. Our business and academic thought leaders collaborate to create new marketing knowledge, which we share in a variety of ways. And one of our most popular are these lunch lectures. So we're delighted to have you here today. Before I begin, let me also point out that you can submit questions during the course of the presentation via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And there will be a discussion with answers and questions at the end of Vanessa's talk. And it's my distinct pleasure to welcome our presenter today. Vanessa Patrick is the Dean of Research and the Bauer Professor of Marketing at the Bauer College of Business at the University of Houston. She's also lead faculty for the Bauer Executive Women in Leadership Program, Fulbright Specialist. Prior to her academic career, she had a career in advertising, so she brings some practical experience to our discussion today. Her research focuses on matters of aesthetics, both the attraction of aesthetics and ways that people can resist or exercise self-regulation in the face of temptation. So it should be a very interesting angle on the discussion today. She is published widely in top journals, was named in 2012 one of the top 50 most productive marketing academics. She's won numerous paper awards. And last but not least, she is a 2009 MSI Young Scholar. So we're delighted to have Vanessa today to talk to us about inclusive design. Vanessa.
Thank you all. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending this talk. I'm delighted to share with you my work. The title of my talk is Designing for All, Creating Customer Value via Inclusive Design. And what I thought I'd do today was to kind of get into the idea of what inclusive design is, talk about when we talk about inclusion, we naturally have to think about who is being excluded. And so we want to talk about who is being unintentionally excluded by marketers. I will introduce you to a framework that we recently published in the Journal of Consumer Psychology called the DARE framework. We'll talk about 3 levels of inclusive design and the idea that inclusive design is not black and white, but in fact, a progression. And finally, we'll conclude with some food for thought, resources, and a question and answer session. I'd like to give a shout out to my collaborators in this area of inclusive design. Candice Hollenbeck from the University of Georgia, Deepa Chandrasekaran from UTSA, BJ Allen, who's recently joined the University of Utah, and Luca Chian from the University of Virginia at Darden. A lot of this work would not be possible without the supporters. I'd like to thank Laura Paracchio and Lauren Block for stewarding the publishing of the Inclusive Design review paper at JCP, the Marketing Science Institute, Barbara, Earl, Kayla, and Kate. And last but not least, the inclusive design champions in the industry who have written about, thought about, and shared their immense actual knowledge about what really goes on in the inclusive design process. From a financial support front, I'd like to also acknowledge the Bauer College of Business and the Transformative Consumer Research Group. So, what is inclusive design? So if you think about inclusive design, it is a design approach in which products, services, and experiences are designed, keeping the extreme user in mind to facilitate the greatest possible match between a product offering and a user. And when you do this, it results in a product offering that delivers value to and benefits for a more diverse customer base. So I'm going to unpack this definition in the next few slides to talk about what we mean by keeping the extreme user in mind, what I mean when I talk about facilitating the greatest possible match, and how, when you take an inclusive design approach, you are able to deliver value and benefits to a more diverse customer base. So let's start with designing with the extreme user in mind. When we think about marketing strategy and the process in which we approach marketing, we very often go through the process where we segment our market and then we target a particular segment, and then we position our product to that segment. And so the marketing strategy approach will often use and characterize the target market in terms of demographics and psychographics and geographic location. And that's all well and good till we actually start executing on that strategy. Then when we execute on the strategy in terms of choosing the people to research or the people to design for, we start talking about the average consumer. And the average consumer, as soon as you start talking about the average consumer, you actually take diversity off the table. And so the average consumer does not exist for all practical purposes, and does not necessarily represent the diversity of your target market. And so what we want to do is we want to think about our target market as a bell curve in which there are a set of users that have full access, but there are other users who experience invisible barriers and have limited access, and extreme users without access. So if you think about inclusive design is thinking about how can we design keeping those extreme users in mind, because if we are able to design for the extreme user, we are most likely going to fulfill the needs for the users with full access. So inclusive design is not only user-centric design, but it is user-led design. So it is about looking at the extremes and actually gaining insight from those extreme consumers. So that's the first one. OXO is a great example for the motivation to design for an extreme consumer. So if you think about the story of OXO, Sam Farber, who was a businessman, he founded OXO in 1990. He was on vacation with his wife Betsy in France, and she was struggling with peeling some apples in their French rental kitchen. And it turns out that he looked at that and said, why should she struggle with a simple thing that everyone should be able to do? And so he came back and he approached a design firm called Smart Design in New York, and with that built the OXO Good Grips line. So what OXO Good Grips does is that at the time they launched with 14 different products with handles of common kitchen tools that were just more easy to use in the kitchen. And this is a great example of the fact that if you have that extreme user in mind, the person who struggles with the kitchen tool, you actually serve the needs of the mainstream market as well. Because who doesn't want, an easy to peel peeler or a easy to handle bottle opener? The second idea with inclusive design is this idea that we want to facilitate a match between the user and the design object. In fact, the World Health Organization defines disability, at least in part, as the mismatch between the features of a person and the features of the environment in which they need to operate. So inspired by this, the author Kat Holmes discusses this idea of inclusive design as seeking to create a greater match between a user and a product in the environment in which the product is being used and for the purpose for which the product is designed. What do I mean by that? I'm going to show you a video of the Xbox adaptive controller, in which you can see how the design of the adaptive controller, keeping this extreme user in mind, actually is able to increase the ability for the entire market to find their best way to design, to use the Xbox. Kayla, you let me know if you cannot hear this sound.
At Xbox, we have a controller design that our fans love. However,
okay, that's not good.
At Xbox, we have a controller design that our fans love. However, for gamers with limited mobility or gamers who don't use both their hands, this controller design might not work best for them.
Pushed you out of the way, I'm sorry. Doorknobs are the worst thing ever invented. Putting on shoes, the cell phones that I use, these are the sorts of things that we don't think about until we have to. And I think about them every day.
Yeah! I have cerebral palsy on my entire right side. This side of the controller is fine. This side doesn't happen. As game platforms have gotten more sophisticated, the controllers have gotten more sophisticated, and it started to get really frustrating.
We designed the Xbox Adaptive Controller through feedback from the accessibility community.
The Xbox Adaptive Controller is really easy. You just plug it in, and then you can plug in various other devices. I can make it work for me the way it has to.
With the Xbox Adaptive Controller, a gamer can game with one hand and one foot, or one hand and their shoulder, or even one foot and their chin.
And I can change it from game to game.
Good, ready? Forward, squeeze tall, there it is.
Craig Hospital is a facility for patients who've either had a spinal cord injury or a traumatic brain injury, and it's a place for their rehab.
Yes! We're here for game night, and we're helping new patients getting back into gaming again. Is that the D-pad?
Yeah.
Okay.
Our role as occupational therapists is to get people back to doing. When the Xbox Adaptive Controller came along, it acted like an Xbox controller and it just worked.
Uh-oh, over there.
Ooh. On the standard Xbox controller, it's just hard to press the buttons because can't really put pressure through my hands. But then with the adaptive controller, I can use like larger joysticks, larger buttons that are easier to press and reach.
Corey and his brother Zachary are twins. Before Corey's injury, Zachary had gamed with him regularly, and that was a way that they related to each other as siblings.
Who do you love playing Xbox with here at Craig Hospital?
Zach.
The Xbox Adaptive Controller and the co-pilot feature allowed them again to play games together. So there's a huge social component to it.
You got that? Yes, yes. They can play any game that they want. I see the confidence just burst out of them.
What's interesting about a match versus mismatch is that match versus mismatch can be based on permanent, temporary, or situational constraints. So there are some people who might have a permanent disability, but all of us perhaps have at some point had some sort of temporary constraints, and then there are situational constraints. And so thinking about inclusion as actually way more than simply accommodating or accounting for people with permanent disabilities, you can think about the vast number of consumers who are, for example, if you look at Dutch, have had an arm injury, or are new parents and basically have to hold a baby while handling something else with just one hand. And so designers have begun to think about looking at how people adapt to the world around them and bringing those insights into the design practice. One of my favorite examples is the example of herbal essences, because it highlights the third point associated with inclusive design, which is when you design with an inclusive design mindset, you benefit a more diverse consumer base. Everyone will experience disability at some point in their life, according to K.R. Liu, who's the head of brand accessibility at Google. It is important to design with and for people with disabilities, because everyone will benefit. So herbal essences, like every other shampoo and conditioner brand, has bottles that look identical, and they are extremely hard to distinguish. And so what they did was that they hired a visually impaired consultant. There are about 7 million visually impaired consumers in the United States. That's about the size of Houston. And these consumers essentially have to figure out how to distinguish between their shampoo and their conditioner. And many consumers do things like put a little bit of chewing gum or some sort of putty on one bottle to distinguish it from the other. What Herbal Essences has done is they essentially used something called tactile labeling, where they laser inscribed different tactile indicators on their bottles. So they essentially have stripes for shampoo, S for stripes, S for shampoo, circles for conditioner, C for circle, C for conditioner, so that you are, whether you are visually impaired or simply a consumer who has soap in their eyes during a shower, are able to benefit from the tactile labeling. So here we have the idea that inclusive design keeps the extreme user in mind, seeks to create a best possible match between the user and the product, and benefits a more diverse consumer base. In fact, many familiar objects and technologies that we use today started out for specific populations, but became mainstream, whether it was text messaging or closed captioning or even flexible straws. While I don't have very much time to focus on why inclusive design, I hope that that is apparent based on what I've talked about so far, but I'd like to highlight a few key things. One, inclusive design is a moral and ethical imperative. It is the right thing to do. Two, it makes business sense. You've attracted a more diverse customer base. You have presumably created greater loyalty, forged a stronger consumer brand relationship. And business consultants from McKinsey to Euromonitor have all talked about the idea that inclusive design is the future. And so we should be thinking about it as marketers. It is also a legal requirement. The 26th of July was the 31st anniversary for the American Disabilities Act. The number of web accessibility, so for example, more than half the web is inaccessible to consumers with various kinds of disabilities. And there has been a huge uptick in the number of lawsuits that relate to web accessibility. So at the very least, we should be thinking about it as a legal requirement. And designers also feel that there is a creative opportunity for better design because extreme users look at and adapt to the product in a way that is innovative and creative. It forces designers to think differently about product design and the product design process. The question, if we want to design keeping an inclusive design mindset in mind, we need to think about who is being unintentionally excluded. Because the mismatch occurs every day and all around us. We simply don't know or notice if we are designers and living in a particular world and a particular zip code that we are familiar with. But if you are excluded, it is an extremely and incredibly personal experience, which is fraught with emotion. And so we need to think about who, and so Kat Holmes says, for inclusion starts with recognizing exclusion. This framework, which we introduced in the Journal of Consumer Psychology paper, is a useful framework to think about who is being unintentionally excluded. The addressing framework is an acronym that talks about the different groups that might be in your target audience whose needs are not being met and who've had to adapt to your product or feel excluded by your product. what I want to talk about today, which is really what the mindset is, how do we use inclusive design to create value for our customers? And to do that, we actually need to understand how consumers respond to being excluded versus being included. And to do that, I wanted to introduce you to two ideas. One is the DARE framework, and the second is the different levels of inclusion. The DARE framework stands for a design, appraisal, response, and experience framework. It is based on appraisal theory, and basically it uses the assumption that being excluded is the deeply personal and emotional experience, and hence that consumers feel a mismatch. They intuitively pick up on being excluded. They perceive a match or a mismatch between the design object and themselves, and when they pick that exclusion up, they appraise that exclusion based on criteria that matter to them. They might ask questions like, how does this product work for me? Is this product really important for my personal goals? Do I have alternatives, or do I have no alternatives in the marketplace? Does using this product make my differences apparent? So based on these kind of appraisal questions, you get you filter down onto goal relevance and product incongruity as key appraisal dimensions that shape consumer response. So the consumer response is based on the degree of match versus mismatch. Now, obviously, we want to be able to create the best possible match, but inclusion or inclusive design can be thought about in terms of levels, which I will get into in just a bit. But level one design is essentially where there is some mismatch that exists, and it's about meeting accessibility standards, and it results in an appraisal which says it's about time that these things were done. And I'll get into each of the different levels in the next slide, but you can imagine that the user who is thinking about being excluded and thinking about appraising this degree of mismatch and match in a particular way might experience frustration and guilt and sadness and shame and anger from a mismatch that matters to them. And on the other hand, they could be experiencing extremely positive emotions like happiness, pride, awe, and elevation based on a match that is created in the marketplace. Now, if you have these different levels of inclusive design, one of the things we propose in our model is that we want to try and achieve diminishing degree of mismatch between the user and the design object. So the first level of mismatch, which is kind of, there is mismatch, but it is there is an attempt to close the gap, is basic access, providing accessibility to consumers. And a lot of this comes from really guidelines that have been provided by government and industry groups. Level one inclusive design really is stems from market-oriented reform policies, and we see that in terms of the ramps or the ASL interpreters or Braille and large print menus. These are level one inclusion, which is pretty much expected based on the American Disabilities Act. But what you want to do for your consumers is you want to go beyond level one and just providing access to actually providing engaged participation, more equitable access based on principles of social justice. A lot of companies today are thinking about inclusive design in this way, to engage participation, to empathize with users, and to design products in a way that influences their lives in a positive way. So Fenty is a great example of this. Fenty was launched in 2017 in a global cosmetics market, which is around $350 billion globally. And they launched and essentially positioned themselves as a brand that catered to a more diverse consumer base. And they launched with 40 different shades, and they are actually up to 52 right now, if I'm not mistaken. But 40 different shades, which essentially recognize the diversity of skin tones that there are on this planet. And the consumer response was overwhelming. Within the first 40 days, they made $100, which showed that consumers really wanted to be recognized, seen, and to be heard. And social media exploded with the consumers talking about the fact that they were finally able to find a skin tone that perfectly matched their skin. So we've talked about providing access, which is good, but not great. We've talked about engaged participation, which is really what where we need to strive towards more broadly. And in an ideal world, we want to design in a way to empower success, where it's not inclusive design, it's just design. And the design process itself is by its very nature inclusive. So what does empowered success look like? Empowered success is really about thriving and facilitating human potential, is solving allows people to have optimal experiences no matter where you are on this planet or where you are on that bell curve. It's inspired by this idea of flow, where the match between the user and the environment is so seamless that and so natural that it fosters this deep enjoyment, and consumers really feel seen and recognized, and there is equity. So, the Nike Fly Ease sneaker is one of those that made a huge splash in the marketplace a few years ago, simply because of the way it was designed and the way it was inspired. So the story goes like this. In 2012, a 16-year-old called Matthew Walser emailed Nike and essentially said, well, I was born with cerebral palsy, and over the last 16 years, my parents have, given me and taught me how to be completely independent. I am heading off to college, and I want shoes that don't look like a medical device. Because while I can dress myself completely, I still need help tying my shoelaces. I'm going to read what he said. At 16 years old, I am completely able to dress myself, but my parents still have to tie my shoes. As a teenager who's striving to become totally self-sufficient, I find this extremely frustrating and at times embarrassing. And so Nike designed a completely hands-free sneaker in which you can, as you can see in the GIF, and you can slip on the shoes without any need for shoelaces. And this is designing for the entire population. And regardless of where you are on that bell curve, this is a cool pair of shoes. And so what we've talked about is the goal being to move from level 1 design to level 2 design to level 3 design, where the consumer response moves from it's about time to it's the right thing to do and it feels fair and just, to this is the way the world should be. one of my favorite quotes from Good to Great, the book, is that good is the enemy of great. And a lot of us have products that are doing perfectly fine in the marketplace and are serving the needs of our customers, the majority of our target market, pretty well. The question is, what is it that will take our products and our services and what we offer consumers to create value for them from good to great? And so based on this work, there are a few best practices I might suggest. One is to ask yourself periodically, who am I unintentionally excluding? To create a diverse and inclusive user-led design teams. A recent study by Capgemini essentially said that a more diverse and inclusive design team is 4 times more likely to create inclusive products. Design with, not for, a diverse consumer base. So co-creating, involving the consumer in the design process, designing with the consumer. And finally, conducting regular inclusion and accessibility audits with the goal of knowing where you are on that continuum to minimizing the mismatch and moving towards a level 3 design. So I wanted to share with you some additional resources. We have a LinkedIn group in which, this is a very emergent topic, and things are changing on a daily basis. So I try to keep the LinkedIn group updated with what's going on in the world of inclusive design. So you can use your phone to scan the QR code and go directly to the LinkedIn group and join the group if you are interested. I've also created for the people in the audience who are teachers or even people who are just lifelong learners, a kind of a starter kit and some mini case studies on how you can perhaps include these ideas of inclusive design in your classroom. As of now, we have about 8 mini case studies in there that give you the background information and allow you to use this information in the classroom if you think that your students might benefit. And with that, I'd like to give you my contact information and welcome you to connect with me on LinkedIn. I look forward to your questions, and I also thank you very much for your attention.
Great.
Thanks, Vanessa. That was, sorry, go ahead.
I was to say thank you so much, Vanessa. Earl and I are both just so excited. So I just wanted to take a minute.
Jump right in there.
Yeah, I
Please,
just wanted to take a minute and just make sure that I also let everybody on the phone know today that with us we have Barbara Kahn from the Wharton School and also MSI's Executive Director. Barbara had a question, and so I thought that maybe she could lead us off today, and then we can pivot into the questions that were submitted electronically. So Barbara, you may go ahead.
Oh, good. Thank you, Kayla, and thank you, Vanessa, for an excellent talk. Unfortunately for me, you provoked more questions than you answered. Obviously, this is just the tip of the iceberg with this kind of stuff. And as I'm sure you know, it's an important topic. And I think everybody on the call understands that in today's society, this is what we were looking at, and that unfortunately, it's been excluded too much or not paid attention to. And I know you don't have the time to do this, but I'm just wondering if in your research packet or your research stream, you look at some of these questions. So if there are not things you're looking at, maybe you can discuss that too. But at any rate, just some broad questions that came to mind, because I actually think this research is so important, and understanding not only how we can continue to do it in the future, but understanding the processes and things about this, from a marketing point of view would be really useful. So I have 2 bundles of questions, and you can help me articulate and put a structure on it that might be better. Let me start with what I think you did in a really fast slide, but didn't have time to go into deeper, is what you call the address or something like that. And as I read it, and it was pretty quick, so it seemed like you were talking about the different types of diversity you could try to address. So that was one of my first questions. You know what you know, and if you're thinking about something tactile, it might occur to you not everybody can touch in the same way. And that example you gave with the vegetable peeler and whatever, but there might be other disabilities that are affected that are not as, say, concrete or obvious as touch. So how do you scan widely enough? So that's one set of questions to address a large group of diversity that it may not be top of mind. And it seems to me that that's what your address framework was trying to get at. And I noticed it was quick. You didn't put it up that fast, but it was somewhat demographically related. I was thinking, well, maybe like my lifestyle would affect I was thinking there might be other dimensions to a diversity framework that you might consider. So that's my first question. How do you consider beyond, say, top of mind and maybe intuitive diversity? How do you make sure you scan widely in order to, so that's one. I suspect it's a big question, but that's one box of questions.
So
let me just ask the second one and then I'll shut up. And the second one, and this is maybe more for academic-minded people in the audience, I was really interested, just because of my own research, that in one of the slides, you expressed emotional reactions to things. And you delineated not only positive and negative actions, but you really showed, emotions, but you showed the flavors, guilt, shame, etc. And I assume, based on what I know about your previous research and what I know about emotions, that there's a reason why you put all of those different flavors of emotions into the framework. And I was just curious how important that was, because you didn't address it. You put it up there and then instantly my brain started going, like there might be implications that would take guilt versus shame as different. And so I know these are very big questions, I understand, but maybe you can just give us some bigger answers and we can look up the framework going forward.
Thank you, Barbara. They are both actually very, very good questions, and I'll address them in the order in which you asked them. Just to preface this, there isn't much empirical work. Actually, there's no empirical work on inclusive design in consumer behavior yet. And so one of the things that we really need to do is start thinking and even validating the DARE model or the levels of inclusive design model, because at this time they are theoretical constructs. The addressing framework is essentially, the addressing is an acronym that it comes actually from previous research. And all it does is that it puts together the full range of identity considerations that you might consider. I also want to, in that light, we have to differentiate between universality and inclusion. It's not easy to be universally liked. And that is why the question is, who am I unintentionally excluding? When you broaden your mindset and ask, who am I unintentionally excluding, and you go down the addressing framework, you might be able to meet the needs of the visually impaired or come up with tactile solutions for them, etc. Now, as you very well pointed out, it's virtually impossible to capture everyone's need. But where inclusive design comes in is to be able to say, I can't give a visually impaired person sight, and I can't make an old person young, but I can certainly design a product that matches them in the environment in which they operate a bit better. I think the goal to create universality is probably an ideal one, very, very hard to exclude. But in our speaking to many of the industry professionals, they say that talking to consumers, watching them, seeing them in action, how they use the product, can give you those ideas about lifestyle and demographics and psychographics as well, which might give you some perspective. So I think that user-led design and the addressing framework might get us closer to inclusive design. With regard to your second question, the different types of emotions that can get generated. Of course, each emotion, as we know, comes from a specific set of appraisal dimensions, and we do address, we do posit in the Journal of Consumer Psychology paper which emotions would arise from what sort of appraisal dimensions. But again, this remains untested. What I would like to encourage the researchers in the room is to actually think about testing these out. One of the things that was the hardest thing to wrap our head around was to kind of look at this mismatch and match. But the great thing about looking at conceptualizing inclusive design as a match versus a mismatch allows you to experimentally test it quite nicely. So you can actually manipulate matches versus mismatches. And so wrapping my head around, conceptualizing it as that in order to facilitate future research is something that I hope will happen. I hope I answered your questions, Barbara.
Yeah, you did. Yeah, thank you very much.
So that was great, great discussion, and that actually has stimulated additional questions. We already had a number that were very good. I'm going to sort of combine them for time's sake, if you will. A couple of questions have related to the trade-off between producing products that would particularly address the issues and needs of a smaller group versus having a broader portfolio. And some have said, for example, target marketing seems to be kind of running contrary to this notion of inclusive design for a broader, wider market. So as a sort of a business model, how do you practice, balance the need for this type of inclusive design and the products that result with the need to have the mass appeal in terms of both, say, targeting communications? You indicated that access is really one of the first barriers. And I wonder, maybe a related question is, does it make sense perhaps to create a company specially focused on these types of products, or should the parent company have that in its portfolio? So it's sort of, what are the business model implications of the idea behind inclusive design?
So let me answer this in a couple of different ways. One thing you might think about is if you wanted to include more consumers or identify a gap in the market where you see consumers' needs not being met, you could consider them a specific segment and you could design for that segment. So that would be creating a niche product for a segment. So the IKEA case study that's in the teaching deck addresses this really nicely. What they argue in that case, in what IKEA's position is if you want to create furniture for people with, who have a hard time standing up and sitting down and stuff. You can create very sophisticated furniture, which costs the earth and the sky, because it's a niche brand. They don't have the economies of scale. They have to design specifically for that tiny niche, and so essentially, the prices are very often exorbitant. What inclusive design does is essentially it says, it doesn't throw target marketing out of the window. It says, within your target, instead of focusing on the average consumer and designing for and meeting the needs of the average consumer, what you want to do is you want to look at a more diverse consumer base. And if you can meet the needs of a more diverse consumer base, you are more likely to meet the needs of consumers who have full access or the majority of the market. And so it's a slightly different way of thinking about designing for a market. Maybe the herbal essences example is a great example of a mass market product, which kind of is still a mass market product. It just happens to have a feature on it that is more inclusive.
That's an interesting example too, because I'm assuming in that case, there was no need to charge a higher fee for the product designed for that particular needs group. It's something that we could all, but as you use the example with the soap in your eyes in the shower, you could, you know, the average consumer who doesn't exist, but we still say that, could use that product. Annie early on had a question about, I think you addressed this somewhat later, but how in the Xbox design example, it benefited the wider user base. But she also had a later question about when you have more than one feature that you've identified, how do you go about sort of prioritizing which you should address first? And that may go back to some of your principles of how you actually do design, inclusive design.
So admittedly, I'm not a gamer. And so I have not exactly used the Xbox myself, but I've read enough about the case study and the case itself to understand that Xbox has created this kind of panel where there are 19 different ways in which you can utilize the device. So it adapts across 19 different ways. You can, you have a foot controller, you have a joystick, you have a knob. So, and depending on the kind of constraint you might have, it has a range of that. In fact, one of the cool things about the Xbox adapter is that they are constantly talking to consumers and looking at how can they develop more devices that allow greater access. So it's kind of one of those things where it's actually a very simple, it's a button, switch on, switch off button. But the way you access that button has a whole range. So right now their panel has 19 different ways to access that same thing. So, as their goal, and actually Microsoft has a really excellent inclusive design toolkit that is worth downloading and reading. And their goal is to be able to include as many people as possible with these different options.
So you mentioned goals. That was actually going to segue to the next question. In your DARE framework for the appraisal aspect, the A in DARE, you mentioned that one of the ways you do that is looking at whether the product or the design helps the person meet their goals. And I thought the example back to Xbox of the twins who could continue to interact socially was a classic example that, the feature had to be as was described with the pad and the plugins and so forth. But the whole point was to create an environment, an opportunity for these two twins to continue the type of social interaction that had been so important to them. So I think that's a great reminder that all of this has to be driven by that fundamental, what is the goal that the user is trying to achieve? You also mentioned the importance about context, and I think a lot of us can relate to the mismatch between design and products and our everyday lives. And it's often when it doesn't seem to work in a context that apparently no one anticipated or whatever. Would you maybe want to elaborate a bit more about that? I think that's an element of design that was often overlooked.
Absolutely. In fact, my interest in this topic stemmed from a knee injury that I had. And, I was teaching a classroom, I tore my ACL, tore my meniscus, and suddenly I was in bed for a few months with, incapacitated and completely horrified at the number of things that I had taken for granted around me. And it started making me really think about, the situational, it's a temporary disability, but it was just not a fun experience at all to be in that situation. And I'm sure other people relate to the frustration that you experience when you are temporary or situationally unable to do something that you feel that should be natural. Now that experience made me think about the fact that there are people who experience this daily, every day of their lives. And so it really sparked that was actually the trigger event that got me interested in this topic. But the idea of situational ability, situations making you feel excluded is a potent one. So the example that that I motivate the JCP paper with is situation of personal equipment, the equipment that you use for safety in different environments. And there's a company Houston based actually, and owned and started by an entrepreneur who's an energy veteran, Jane Henry, and she started this company called See Her Work. And the reason she started it was because as a woman engineer in a very, very male-dominated industry, none of her safety equipment worked. Women have to use duct tapes. Their gloves are sliding off when they are doing dangerous things. And what I think what fascinated me the most in talking to her was the fact that it was not just the functionality of the fact that these things don't work. It was the feeling of being not part of this industry that drove her to start this company. And so this idea, we can enter environment, and the situation and the environment can make us feel that we are not part of it. Then that situational exclusion is something that I think is worth thinking about for marketers as well.
I think that's one of the great features about that DARE approach, is that it focuses on the user experience and works back from that to what the solution needs to be. Engineers may approach it the other way and say, I know how to fix this product to make it more quote unquote accessible, but they may not understand yet the implications, the emotions, as Barbara raised with you. Sophia had a question, maybe it's kind of a natural segue from this talk about the environment, to applying this type of approach or thinking to things like services, or even redesigning experiences in places. The products probably are the easiest to conceptualize what the problem is and what the solution might be, but I'm sure this does apply more widely. So what are your thoughts about how to do this type of thinking to redesigning services, experiences in places?
Architects play a great role in servicescapes, and architects have really much more evolved sensibility about inclusive design compared to marketers. And so a lot of the inspiration for the inclusive design work that I've written about so far has really come from understanding education and architecture. I mean, some of the most inclusive places right now are schools and playgrounds, because from the time kids to the goal to include kids in a variety of ways, to not constrain the activities, has been something that has been foremost on architects' minds. And so if you think about extending that to service escapes, one of the case studies that I put together in the teaching deck is on Hampton Inns, which created the first fully accessible or fully inclusive hotel rooms, which where things are not too high up and the seats are high enough, and there's a whole bunch of features associated with those hotel rooms. But if you think about servicescapes and classrooms and any spaces that we occupy, because they are constructed by architects, they are presumably more likely to be inclusive because they are thinking about that already. I don't know whether this is true. This is my judgment of it, though.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And you did mention in passing the issue of design for websites. Barbara?
I just wanted to weigh in on that, because especially the hotel idea, and I see another question in the chat kind of relates to this also. So this is just a personal anecdote, but I wonder how you handle it. And I think it's something that Ravina was kind of getting at as well. So when I go to a hotel room and I'm put into a hotel room that's designed for a disabled person, it actually doesn't meet my needs so well. Like when you were talking about the game situation, and you can adjust it to what you want, but some of these adjustments that you're making to be more inclusive, there's trade-offs. And And they were saying, other people have mentioned in the questions this notion of typecasting, and there could be a negative kind of point to it. So as the broader question, again, trying to keep this higher level, have you done any cost benefit profitability analyses, how this affects, or do you have any intuition on that? Can there be some costs to being too broad, and therefore you're penalizing people who don't have this need, and you're actually making it a little bit less accessible to me? If you can't do what you said, your answer was neat and clean in the Game Boy, but it's not always so neat and clean.
You're absolutely right. And these are the tricky issues, right? The trade-offs. And I think that the idea with inclusive design is the match versus the mismatch. So the same design object can be a match for somebody and a mismatch for somebody else. And in the same way, something that is inclusive, might actually make your full access user feel this is a mismatch for me. I totally get that. But inclusive design, I mean, I think that through the design process, it is probably more, and again, I don't have a good answer, I don't have data, but I think if you think about the strength of the signal from the marketplace, the full access consumers have a stronger signal in the marketplace. And so most often when you're designing, you're going to hear their signal quite loudly and naturally accommodate for it. But the way I think about it is to think about Ansough's theory of weak signaling, and to say, well, there's great value in the weak signaling. It doesn't drown out the loud signal, but if you pay attention to the weak signal, you just create a better product. Now, I think your question on cost benefit analysis, can you alienate a huge part of your market? Those are great questions that honestly I don't have answers to. We don't have, I mean, it's such an emergent trend that we don't even have failed products that are inclusive. We don't have anything that we know about, at least that I have come across, which would be considered an inclusive product that failed. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So Annie, maybe, I'm sorry, Vanessa, as a maybe closing thought here, to elaborate a little bit on what I think is fundamental to the entire presentation, that is taking the empathetic point of view, the view of the user, who may represent a group that historically has been excluded, has even been stigmatized. Is there a balance, though, to be achieved between doing things for those individuals, those communities, versus engaging with them, letting them help in the design process, come up with the ideas? It's a difference between telling pedestrians they should help people over curbs in a wheelchair versus putting a ramp so they can do it themselves. And the ADA, the premise behind the ADA is to empower the individual, not to, encourage charity, which is also a good thing. But so maybe just closing thoughts, because I think there is a danger of do-goodism here, that we're going to go out and do things on behalf of these folks instead of with them. So your thought.
So in the Journal of Consumer Psychology paper, we talk about 3 levels of design. There's a designer-centric approach, where essentially the designer is the god and knows all and designs for everybody. Definitely, an outdated approach. A more common approach is something called the user-centric approach, which is still where designers are designing, but they are focusing on the users and what they might need. And in many cases, you could misunderstand what a user might need, might over-design or under-design. Inclusive design is more of a user-led approach, which is really about having the user and the consumer lead the design, and the designer merely being the executor of this idea, as opposed to the person who proposes and designs the idea. So it's a kind of a different shift in mindset, and saying, I'm not designing for you, I'm designing with you. And a lot of the new technologies, whether it is co-creation or crowdsourcing, they lend themselves really nicely to user-led design. And so I'm hoping, and a lot of these inclusive design product champions in industry, really emphasizing the importance of user-led design, focusing on meeting those needs of the more extreme consumer.
Well, that's a great upbeat note, I think, to conclude. A fantastic presentation, good Q&A discussions. I want to thank Vanessa again. Thank you, Barbara. I want to remind the audience that we will be sending an email with a link to the recording of this event, and you will be able to access the slides that Vanessa will be sharing with you as well. And as she indicated, there's a lot of contact information at the end of her presentation. I'm sure she would love to hear from you. And again, thanks to all of our audience for attending. I just want to remind everyone that since 1961, nonprofit MSI has brought together the best minds in marketing from major corporations and top business schools around the world to improve business practice by applying science to marketing's biggest challenges. And the result is what we share with you today. So we look forward to seeing you at our next lunch lecture and other MSI events. And thanks again to all.
Thank you so much.